I stood in the shadows of my own rose garden, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as another woman sipped champagne from my favorite crystal flute. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be 3,000 miles away in London, closing a merger. But the deal had finished early, and I wanted to surprise my husband, Mark. I wanted to tell him that I was finally ready to quit the late nights and start the family he'd been begging for. Instead, the surprise was on me. The house, the one I had spent 3 years of my life paying for, every single mortgage payment coming out of my sweat and tears, was glowing with light. There were catering vans in the driveway. Laughter spilled out onto the patio. And there, in the center of the living room, stood Mark. He looked handsome. He looked happy, but he wasn't looking for me. He had his arm wrapped tightly around a blonde girl who couldn't have been older than 24. She was wearing a white silk dress. My white silk dress. The one I had bought for our upcoming 5-year anniversary. "A toast," Mark shouted, raising his glass. The room went quiet. "To Sarah, for making me feel like a man again and for showing me that life is about more than just the next promotion. To our future and to this beautiful home we're finally going to fill with love." The guests cheered. My friends, my neighbors, people I had invited into my home, people who had eaten my food and drank my wine, were all raising their glasses to the woman who was currently occupying my life like a parasite. The humiliation was a physical weight in my chest. It felt like someone had reached into my throat and squeezed my heart until it stopped. Mark hadn't just cheated, he had moved her in. He had invited the world to watch him replace me in real time, assuming I was too busy making money to ever notice. "He thinks I'm the ATM," I whispered to the cold night air. "He thinks I'm the bank that never checks the balance." I watched as Sarah leaned over and whispered something in his ear, giggling. Mark laughed and patted her stomach. That's when I saw it, the tiny, unmistakable bump beneath the silk of my dress. She wasn't just the mistress. She was the new and improved version. I felt a surge of white-hot rage that nearly sent me screaming through those glass doors. I wanted to tear that dress off her back. I wanted to throw Mark's designer suits into the pool. I wanted to humiliate them in front of everyone. But then I stopped. I took a deep, shaky breath and felt the ice begin to settle over my heart. If I walked in there now, I'd be the crazy, jealous wife. I'd be the villain in their twisted fairy tale. Mark would get half the house in a messy divorce, take a chunk of my savings, and live happily ever after with his new family on my dime. No, that wasn't going to happen. I looked at the house one last time. Every brick was mine. Every piece of art was mine. Mark had contributed nothing but his presence and his lies. He thought he was the king of this castle, but he forgot who signed the deed. I turned around and walked silently back to my car, parked 2 blocks away. My hands were steady as I gripped the steering wheel. I wasn't going to a hotel. I was going to my office. Mark wanted a life of luxury with his new bride. I was going to give it to him. But first, I was going to make sure that by the time I was done, he wouldn't even be able to afford the gas to drive away from the wreckage of his life. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer. It was 11:00 p.m. on a Saturday. He answered on the second ring. "Is the legacy trust active?" I asked, my voice devoid of all emotion. "Yes, Claire, but you haven't funded it yet. Why?" "I'm funding it tonight," I said, "and I want you to start the asset liquidation protocol for the primary residence. Immediately." "Claire, that's your home. If you do that, Mark will be served with an eviction notice within 48 hours. What's going on?" I looked at my wedding ring, glinting in the streetlights. I pulled it off my finger and dropped it into the cup holder. "Mark is throwing a party," I said. "I just want to make sure I'm the one who turns off the lights." I sat in my car for 20 minutes after hanging up with my lawyer, watching the shadows of my friends dancing against the curtains of my living room. Every burst of laughter that drifted through the air felt like a slap. They knew, all of them. They were eating my appetizers and drinking my vintage wine while celebrating my replacement. I didn't cry. I didn't have time for tears. I had an empire to protect and a traitor to dismantle. I drove to my office, a cold, glass-and-steel sanctuary where I had spent more nights than I ever had in that house. I bypassed the security desk and went straight to the server room. My hands were steady as I pulled up the financial dashboard for Vance Enterprises, the holding company I had created to manage our lifestyle. Mark called himself the managing director, but his only real job was spending the money I generated. He had a corporate credit card, a generous stipend, and access to the auxiliary accounts. He thought he was a partner. He was actually just an authorized user on a leash he didn't know existed. Click, blocked, click, revoked, I whispered, my finger hovering over the mouse. In 30 seconds, I cut off his air supply. I froze his credit cards. I deauthorized his access to the joint venture funds. I even disconnected his phone plan. By tomorrow morning, Mark Vance would find that his digital world had simply stopped working. But that was just the beginning. I pulled up the deed to our house. Mark had insisted his name be on it for tax purposes, but he had signed a very specific, very dense post-nuptial agreement 2 years ago when he wanted me to bail out his failed restaurant venture. He hadn't read the fine print. He just wanted the check. The agreement stated that in the event of documented moral turpitude or lifestyle endangerment, the primary residence would revert to a private trust controlled solely by me. And thanks to my nanny cam footage of him and Sarah in our bed, I had all the documentation I needed. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously moving every cent of my liquid assets into offshore accounts and irrevocable trusts. I left exactly $1.42 in our joint checking account. Enough for a candy bar, but not enough for the morning after brunch he'd undoubtedly planned. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Hey babe, hope London is going well. Just woke up and noticed my card declined at the coffee shop. Probably just a glitch, right? Talk later. Love you." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. He was still in bed, probably with Sarah, probably in my Italian silk sheets. He thought it was a glitch. He had no idea the glitch was standing in a high-rise office building, preparing to erase him. I didn't reply. Instead, I sent a message to a very specific contact in my phone, a professional moving crew that specialized in high-conflict residential transitions. "I want the house emptied," I told the manager when he picked up. "Not just my stuff, everything. Furniture, electronics, even the light fixtures. If I paid for it, it goes into storage. I want them to wake up in a house that looks like a concrete shell." "And the occupants, ma'am?" the manager asked. "Give them 10 minutes to grab their clothes," I said. "Then change the locks. The eviction notice will be taped to the front door by the time you're done." I stood by the window, watching the city wake up. Mark had spent years underestimating me because I was just a worker bee. He thought my silence was weakness. He thought my long hours meant I wasn't paying attention. He was about to learn that when a woman like me stops talking, it's because she's already finished the job. I stood across the street in the backseat of a black SUV with tinted windows, sipping a black coffee that tasted like iron. I wanted to watch. I needed to see the moment the fantasy died. At exactly 8:00 a.m., 3 massive, unmarked moving trucks pulled into my driveway. A team of 12 men in black uniforms jumped out. They didn't knock. They used the master key I had provided. The silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the heavy thud of the front door swinging open. I checked my phone. The internal security cameras were still active for my viewing only. Mark appeared at the top of the stairs, clad only in his silk boxers, looking confused and bleary-eyed. Sarah was right behind him, wrapped in one of my plush cashmere robes. "What the hell is this?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking as the movers began systematically unbolting the $10,000 crystal chandelier in the foyer. "Who are you? Get out of my house." The foreman, a man who looked like he'd wrestled bears for fun, didn't even look up from his clipboard. "We're here for the assets, Mr. Vance. You have 9 minutes and 40 seconds left to vacate the premises with your personal effects. Clothes and toiletries only. Everything else is listed on the inventory of the Vance Legacy Trust." "Trust? What trust? I live here. I'm the owner." Mark lunged for the foreman, but two of the larger movers stepped in his way like a brick wall. "You're an occupant," the foreman corrected coldly. "And according to this," he held up the eviction notice and the signed post-nuptial agreement, "your occupancy has been terminated due to a breach of the Lifestyle Endangerment Clause. You were served digitally at 4:00 a.m. Check your email. Oh, wait, your phone service was cut, wasn't it?" I watched on my screen as Mark's face went from angry red to a sickly, pale green. He scrambled for his phone on the nightstand, but a mover was already wrapping it in bubble wrap and tossing it into a box labeled electronics, proprietary. "That's my phone," Mark screamed. "Paid for by the company, sir," the mover said without stopping. "It stays." Sarah began to hysterical cry, her hands shaking as she watched men carry out the velvet sofa she had been lounging on just hours before. She tried to grab a designer vase from the side table, one I'd bought in Italy, but a mover gently but firmly took it from her hands. "The robe too, miss," the foreman added, pointing to the cashmere she was wearing. "That was a gift purchased on the primary's corporate account. It's on the list." The humiliation was total. I watched through the window of my SUV as Mark and Sarah were ushered out onto the front lawn less than 10 minutes later. Mark was in a t-shirt and jeans he'd scrambled to put on, holding a single trash bag of his socks and underwear. Sarah was shivering in a cheap gym outfit she'd found in her gym bag, her hair a bird's nest of tangles. They stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by the high-end neighbors who were now peeking through their curtains and walking their dogs unusually slowly past my house. The power couple of the engagement party was now just two homeless loiterers on a manicured suburban street. Mark looked at the front door as the locksmith began drilling out the old cylinders to install the new, high-security biometric locks. He looked at the empty driveway where his Tesla, also a company lease, was currently being hooked up to a tow truck. Then he looked toward my SUV. He couldn't see me through the tint, but he knew. He stared at the dark glass, his chest heaving with rage and desperation. My phone buzzed. It was an email from the private investigator. "Found the doctor's records for the mistress, Sarah. You're going to want to see the date of conception and the other name on the insurance paperwork." I opened the file, and for the first time since I landed in London, I felt a different kind of shock. Mark wasn't just a cheater. He was a much bigger fool than I had imagined. "Oh, Mark," I whispered, clicking save on the document. "You didn't just break our marriage. You ruined yourself for a lie." I stared at the medical report on my tablet, the blue light reflecting in my eyes as the SUV pulled away from the curb. I watched Mark in the rearview mirror, a shrinking figure clutching a trash bag, looking like a man who had just fallen off the edge of the world. He deserved to fall, but the person he was falling for wasn't exactly a soft place to land. According to the records my investigator had pulled, Sarah hadn't just used the company insurance I paid for, she had been seeing a specialist for months. The conception date was clearly listed. Mark was 3 weeks away on a golf trip in Florida during that entire window. But that wasn't even the best part. The other name listed as the emergency contact and secondary insured wasn't Mark. It was Marcus Thorne, Mark's former business partner, the man he had a falling out with 3 years ago because Marcus allegedly stole his ideas. It wasn't a baby to cement their love. It was a weapon. Sarah was Marcus's girlfriend, and they had been playing a long game to drain Mark, and by extension, me, of every penny we had. Mark was too blinded by his own ego and her innocent, blonde act to realize he was being farmed for cash like a prize cow. "He's not just a traitor," I muttered, a cold laugh escaping my lips. "He's the Mark." I pulled up to a high-end hotel, the kind where the staff knows how to be invisible. I checked in under my maiden name, took a long, boiling shower, and sat at the desk in a plush robe. My phone was blowing up. Mark had finally found a way to get online. Probably borrowed a phone from a sympathetic neighbor or used a public terminal. The messages were a frantic, messy pile of desperation and bile. "Claire, you've lost your mind. You can't just kick me out. Sarah is pregnant, she's stressed. If anything happens to the baby, I'm suing you for everything." Then, 10 minutes later, Please, babe, I made a mistake. The party was a lapse in judgment. I was lonely. You're always working. Let's talk. Just give me access to the accounts so I can get a hotel for the night. I'm literally on the street. I didn't answer. I waited. I wanted him to stew in his own loneliness for a bit. I looked at my laptop screen. My legal team had sent over the next phase. Since the house was now empty and the locks were changed, the next step was the company audit. Mark had been signing off on consulting fees for months, thinking I wouldn't notice because the amounts were small. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. All of those fees had been going into a shell company registered to Sarah's sister. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. I could have just called the police. I could have ended it right there. But I didn't want him in a cell yet. I wanted him to see the look on Marcus Thorne's face when the money stopped flowing. I wanted to see Sarah's loyalty evaporate the second Mark became a liability instead of a meal ticket. I sent a single text back to Mark. Meet me at the office tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. Bring Sarah. I have the medical records and the audit results. If you aren't there, the police will be at your door by 10:00. I turned my phone off and slept for the first time in 48 hours. It was the best sleep of my life. I arrived at the office early. I wanted to be the one sitting in the high-backed leather chair, framed by the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the city I had conquered. When Mark and Sarah walked in, they looked like they had crawled out of a storm. Mark's eyes were bloodshot, and Sarah was wearing a borrowed coat that was 2 sizes too big, clutching her stomach as if it were a shield. They sat across from me. The silence was deafening. I didn't offer them water. I didn't offer them a seat. They just took them because their legs were shaking. Claire, Mark started, his voice cracking. Whatever you think you saw at the house, it's not what it looks like. We can settle this quietly. Just give me my share of the equity and we'll go our separate ways. Your share? I leaned forward, my hands folded neatly on the desk. Mark, you don't have a share. You have a debt. An embezzlement debt of exactly $212,000. I slid the audit report across the glass table. It hit the center with a sharp clack. Sarah's eyes darted to the paper, then back to me. She looked terrified, but beneath the fear there was a flicker of something else, calculation. I didn't embezzle anything, Mark shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. Those were business expenses, networking. Networking with Sarah's sister's shell company? I raised an eyebrow. I don't think a judge will see it that way. But that's actually the least of your problems today, Mark. I pulled out the second folder, the one with the medical records. Sarah's face went pale. She reached for the folder, but I tapped it with my pen, keeping it just out of her reach. Mark, you've been acting like the proud father-to-be, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. But I'm curious. Were you with Sarah on the night of the 14th 3 months ago? Because according to this, that's when this blessing was conceived. And if I recall, you were in Florida with your old buddy, Marcus Thorne. Mark frowned, his brain struggling to connect the dots. Yeah, I was in Florida. So what? We were together before that and right after. Actually, I interrupted, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a surveillance shot of Sarah and Marcus Thorne entering a hotel room in Miami on that same weekend. You weren't the only one Sarah was networking with that weekend. Marcus was there too, and he's the one listed as the emergency contact on these prenatal records, not you. The air left the room. Mark turned to Sarah, his mouth hanging open. Sarah, what is she talking about? Who is Marcus Thorne to you? Sarah didn't look at him. She looked at me. The innocent girl act dissolved instantly. Her shoulders straightened, and her gaze turned icy. Marcus is a man who actually knows how to run a business, Mark, Sarah said, her voice sharp and mocking. He's the one who told me how easy you'd be. You're so desperate to feel like a big shot that you didn't even notice I was funneling your wife's money straight back to the man you hate the most. Mark looked like he'd been struck by lightning. You were with him the whole time, the baby. It's his. Of course it's his, she sneered, standing up. You were just the bank account, Mark, but it looks like the bank is closed. She turned to me. What now, Claire? You going to call the cops? Go ahead. I didn't sign your post-nup. I don't owe you anything. I smiled. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Oh, Sarah, I'm not calling the cops on you," I said softly. "I'm calling the cops on Marcus. You see, while you were busy funneling my money to him, Marcus was using that money to buy insider information about my firm's upcoming trades. That's a federal crime. And since you're his accomplice and the mother of his child, your assets and his are being frozen as we speak." Sarah's confidence shattered. "What? No, he said it was safe." "Nothing is safe when you steal from me," I said. Just then, the heavy double doors of the conference room opened. Two men in suits with badges clipped to their belts walked in. "Sarah Miller, Marcus Thorne has just been taken into custody. We have some questions about a shell company and some unauthorized wire transfers." Silence that followed the heavy click of the handcuffs on Sarah's wrists was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Mark stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his fiancée had just been led away by federal agents. He looked smaller than he had 5 minutes ago, deflated, like a balloon that had finally lost all its air. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just watched him. "Claire," he whispered, finally turning to look at me. His lower lip was trembling. "I didn't know, I swear to God, I didn't know she was working with Marcus. I thought she loved me. I thought I was finally building something that was mine." "Yours," I laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Mark, you didn't build a single thing. You took my money, my home, and my trust, and you handed it over to a woman who saw you as nothing more than a useful idiot. You weren't a partner. You were a puppet." He took a step toward the desk, reaching out a hand as if he could still touch the life he had thrown away. "I was stupid. I was so incredibly stupid. But please, Claire, I have nowhere to go. My accounts are empty. The house is locked. Even my clothes are in a trash bag on the curb. You can't just leave me like this. We were married for 5 years." "We were married for 5 years," I agreed, standing up slowly. I walked around the desk until I was inches from him. He smelled like desperation and the cheap hotel soap he must have used this morning. "And for 4 of those years, I worked 16-hour days so you could live like a king. I bought you the Tesla. I bought you the bespoke suits. I gave you a title you didn't earn. And how did you thank me?" "I made a mistake," he sobbed, actually dropping to his knees. It was pathetic. A grown man groveling on the carpet of the office I built. "Please, just let me stay in the guest house, just for a week. Until I figure things out, I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want." "You already signed everything I wanted, Mark," I said, looking down at him with nothing but cold pity. "You signed that postnup. You signed those consulting checks that I've already flagged as fraudulent. You've even signed your own confession by admitting on camera, yes, this room is recorded, that you made a mistake with the company funds." Mark's head snapped up, his eyes wide with terror. "What?" "I don't want you in my guest house," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, quiet calm. "I don't even want you in this zip code. But I'm a fair woman. I've left a small gift for you at the front desk." He scrambled to his feet, a flicker of hope crossing his tear-streaked face. "A gift, a check. Thank you, Claire, I knew you still cared." "It's not a check, Mark," I interrupted. "It's a bus ticket to your mother's house in Ohio, and a copy of the divorce papers. I've already signed them. If you contest them, I release the embezzlement evidence to the DA. If you sign them now, I'll let you walk out of here without a police escort. For now." Mark stared at me, the realization finally sinking in. The silent triumph wasn't just about taking back the house or the money. It was about the total surgical removal of his dignity. "You're a monster," he spat, though his voice was weak. "No, Mark," I said, turning my back on him to look out at the city. "I'm the person who paid for the monster's lifestyle, and the bill is finally due." I watched from my window as Mark shuffled out of the building, clutching a manila envelope and a one-way bus ticket like they were the remains of a burnt-out life. He looked small. He looked broken. But he was just a symptom. Marcus Thorne was the disease. Marcus had been my shadow for years. He was the one who whispered in Mark's ear that he was underappreciated. He was the one who planted Sarah in that bar where Mark accidentally met her. Marcus didn't just want my money. He wanted to see me humiliated because I had beaten him for the senior partner position 6 years ago. I picked up my desk phone. "Send him in," I said. The door opened, but it wasn't a federal agent. It was my head of security, followed by a man in a rumpled suit holding a briefcase. It was Marcus Thorne's lawyer. Marcus was currently sitting in a holding cell, but his legal team was already scrambling to find a leak in the dam I had built. "Mrs. Vance," the lawyer started, trying to sound authoritative. "My client is prepared to offer a full settlement. He'll return the embezzled funds Sarah took, plus interest, if you drop the insider trading allegations. It was a misunderstanding of market data, nothing more." I didn't invite him to sit. I didn't even look at the settlement papers he tried to slide onto my desk. "A misunderstanding?" I asked, walking toward the bookshelf where a small, framed photo of my father stood. "Marcus used my husband to steal my proprietary trade signals. He used Sarah to bypass my encryption. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling. That's a hostile takeover of my personal life." "He's willing to pay $5 million, the lawyer pushed. "Cash, today. You get your money back and everyone moves on." I turned around and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a woman who had already seen the end of the movie. $5 million? That's interesting, I said. "Because according to the deep trace audit I ran on Marcus's offshore holdings this morning, $5 million is exactly what he has left in his primary Cayman account. If he gives that to me, he'll have zero. No money for a defense. No money for his mistress's bail. Nothing." The lawyer's face twitched. "How did you get access to his offshore records?" "I didn't," I lied smoothly. "He gave it to me. Well, Sarah did. In exchange for a cooperation recommendation to the feds, she gave me his master passwords. She figured if she was going down, she might as well burn the bridge she was standing on." The lawyer turned pale. He knew that without that offshore cash, Marcus Thorne was a dead man walking in the legal world. "I don't want the $5 million, I said, leaning over my desk. "I want Marcus to see what it feels like to be the mark. I've already contacted the SEC, but I've also contacted his biggest investors, the ones who think he's a genius. I told them exactly how he's been spending their capital, on a honey trap scheme that failed spectacularly." "You'll destroy his reputation," Sterling gasped. "No," I corrected. "I'm just making his triumph as silent as mine. Tell Marcus the deal is off. I don't want his money, I want his bankruptcy, both financial and moral." As the lawyer rushed out of the room, I felt a vibration on my private line. It was a restricted number. I picked it up. "Claire," the voice was raspy, muffled. It was Marcus. He must have used his one phone call from the precinct. "You think you've won? You think you can just erase me? I still have the files, Claire. The ones Mark copied from your home server. If I go down, I'm leaking your firm's client list to the dark web." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. "Marcus, you really should have checked the file names before you had Mark copy them." "What are you talking about?" "The folder was labeled Client Alpha, wasn't it?" I asked. "It's a honeypot, Marcus. It's filled with dummy data and a self-executing tracking worm. The moment you, or anyone you send it to, tries to open those encrypted files, it pings the FBI's cybercrime division with your exact GPS coordinates. You didn't steal my secrets. You stole your own arrest warrant." The silence on the other end of the line was the most beautiful sound I had heard all week. I barely had time to savor the silence from Marcus's end of the line before my assistant buzzed in, her voice sounding uncharacteristically shaken. "Claire, Martha Vance is here. I told her you were busy, but she's refusing to leave the lobby. She's making a scene." I sighed, rubbing my temples. The mother-in-law. The woman who had taught Mark that the world was an all-you-can-eat buffet and someone else always picked up the tab. "Send her in," I said, "and call security to stand right outside the door. I don't want her staying a second longer than necessary." The doors burst open, and Martha marched in, draped in a fox fur coat despite the mild weather. Her face was a mask of calculated outrage, her eyes darting around my office as if she were appraising the furniture for a garage sale. "You cold-hearted, vindictive little girl," she shrieked, slamming her designer handbag onto my glass desk. "I just got a call from my son. He's at a bus station. A bus station, Claire. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is for a Vance? He's lucky I gave him a ticket at all, Martha, I said, not moving from my chair. Most people would have given him a police escort. He made a mistake, men do that, she snapped, leaning over the desk until I could smell the gin on her breath. But you've stripped him of everything. You've locked him out of his own home. You've frozen his life. You think you're so smart with your trusts and your audits, but you've forgotten one thing. I raised an eyebrow. And what would that be, besides the fact that I'm the one who paid for your hip replacement last year? Martha's lip curled into a sneer. She reached into her bag and pulled out a faded, yellowing envelope. She tossed it onto the desk like it was a winning card. Your father's legacy trust, the one that owns this firm and that house, she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. He didn't build it alone. He had a silent partner. My late husband, Richard. They had a handshake deal, Claire. A deal that gave the Vance family a 20% stake in the foundation of this entire company if it ever went public or changed hands. I felt a small prickle of unease, but I kept my face like stone. A handshake deal isn't worth the paper it's not written on, Martha. If there was a stake, it would be in the filings. It's not. Oh, it isn't in the public filings, Martha laughed, a harsh, dry sound. It was a side letter. A gentleman's agreement kept in the private archives. Richard kept his copy. I found it in the safe deposit box this morning. She tapped the envelope. If I take this to court, I'll tie up your assets for years. I'll freeze your ability to trade. I'll make sure that by the time the lawyers are done, there won't be enough left of this company to pay for your morning coffee. Unless... Unless what? I asked. Unless you drop the divorce. You give Mark back the house, you give me a $5 million consulting settlement, and we all pretend this nasty little Sarah business never happened. You stay the working wife, and we stay the family you were lucky to marry into. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Martha's smug, wrinkled face. She actually thought she had me. She thought she could use a ghost from the past to haunt my future. You really are a piece of work, Martha, I said, slowly picking up the envelope. You'd let your son stay with a woman who humiliated him just so you can keep your country club membership. I'd do anything to keep what is mine, she replied. I opened the envelope. I pulled out the letter. I read it carefully, line by line. Martha watched me, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. But as I reached the bottom of the page, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I started to laugh. What's so funny? Martha demanded. This letter, I said, holding it up to the light. It is real. It's my father's signature, and it does mention a 20% stake for Richard Vance. Exactly, Martha crowed. So start writing the check. But, I said, my smile widening, you clearly didn't read the conditionality clause on page 2. It says the stake only vests if the Vance family maintains the integrity and reputation of the partnership. It specifically mentions that any act of financial fraud or domestic betrayal against the primary holder, that's me, immediately nullifies the agreement and forfeits the stake back to the trust. Martha's grin vanished. What? That's impossible. Richard wouldn't sign that. He did, I said, sliding the paper back to her. My father was a better businessman than yours was. He knew exactly what kind of people the Vances were. He built a trap for you 30 years ago, Martha, and you just walked right into it by bringing this to me. I stood up and signaled to the security guards. Martha, you didn't just lose the stake you thought you had. By presenting this as a threat, you've just committed extortion. And since I'm still the head of this firm, I'm formally triggering the reputation forfeiture clause. Not only do you get nothing, but I'm now legally required to reclaim the Vance name from the trust. Meaning. I leaned in close to her ear. The house is being renamed, the accounts are being closed, and you, Martha, are going to have to pay back every cent of that hip replacement. I'll see you in court. Martha's laughter followed her out the door, a jagged, desperate sound that chilled me more than her threats ever could. You think you've won, Claire, she screamed as security took her elbows. Go look at your sanctuary now. Mark didn't just leave. He made sure you'd never want to step foot in that mausoleum again. I didn't wait for her to finish. I grabbed my keys and sprinted for the elevator. My mind was racing through every nightmare scenario. Had he left the gas on? Had he flooded the place? Or was it something more personal? When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same from the outside, a grand, silent monument of limestone and glass. But as I stepped through the front door, the smell hit me first. It wasn't smoke, it was paint. I walked into the foyer, and my breath hitched. The moving crew had stripped the furniture, but they hadn't touched the walls. Now, the pristine white gallery walls were covered in jagged black spray paint. Cold, robot, workaholic. The words were slashed across the plaster in Mark's unmistakable, messy handwriting. But he hadn't stopped there. I walked into the kitchen, and my heart shattered. He had smashed the marble island with a sledgehammer, leaving deep, jagged craters in the stone I'd imported from Italy. But the worst was in my studio, the room where I kept my mother's original architectural sketches and my private journals. He hadn't burned them. That would have been too quick. Instead, he had poured industrial-grade bleach over everything. The sketches, the only things I had left of my mother's hand, were now just white, bubbling ruins on the floor. I stood in the center of the room, the fumes of bleach and paint stinging my eyes. I felt a sob rising in my throat, a wave of pure, unadulterated grief. He had targeted the only part of me that wasn't about money or power. He had targeted my soul. "You coward," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You absolute pathetic coward." I looked around the wreckage. This was what Martha meant by irreparable. He wanted me to look at these walls and see my own failures as a wife. He wanted me to feel the coldness he accused me of every time I chose a bored meeting over one of his drunken parties. I walked over to the wall where he had painted empty in huge, dripping letters. I ran my hand over the black paint. It was still tacky, still fresh. Just like his trail. I pulled out my phone and called my head of security. "He didn't go to the bus station," I said, my voice turning from glass to steel. "He came here first. Check the local hardware store's CCTV for a sledgehammer purchase this morning, and then check the GPS on the old SUV, the one I kept in the third garage. He knew I wouldn't think to lock the manual override on that one." "On it, Claire. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied. "But I need a cleaning crew, not the standard one. I need a hazardous waste team, and call my contractor. Tell him we're not just repairing the house." I looked at the ruined sketches of my mother. I realized then that I had been trying to preserve a past that was already gone. I had been living in a museum of what should have been, while Mark and Martha were termites eating the foundation. "We're gutting it," I told the contractor when he picked up. "I want every wall Mark touched torn down to the studs. I want the marble crushed into gravel. I'm not living in his wreckage." I walked back out to the driveway. I looked at the black SUV idling in the street. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a demolition expert. "We found the SUV, Claire," my security lead crackled over the phone. "He's at a motel near the border. He's with someone, not Sarah, it's a guy. Looks like a broker." "He's trying to sell the one thing I didn't freeze," I realized. "The Vance family heirlooms. The jewelry my father gave Martha, which technically belongs to the estate." "Keep him there," I said, putting the car in gear. "I want to be there when the police explain the difference between vandalism and felony grand larceny." The cheap sleep motel smelled of grease and regret. I pulled my SUV into the gravel lot, the headlights cutting through the midnight fog like twin blades. My security team was already positioned by the door of room 14. I didn't wait for them to announce me. I walked up to the door and kicked it open with a force that sent a shudder through my own spine. Inside, the room was a mess of half-eaten takeout and stained carpets. Mark was hunched over the bed, his back to me. Opposite him sat a man in a leather jacket, the black market broker. Spread out on the floral bedspread were my family's heirlooms. My grandmother's emerald brooch, the vintage Cartier watch my father had worn every day of his life, and the diamond tennis bracelet Martha had stolen from the estate safe. Mark spun around, his eyes bulging with terror. "Claire, how did you?" "The GPS, Mark. You always were too lazy to check the settings," I said, my voice dangerously low. I looked at the broker. "Take your hands off the jewelry and leave. Now, unless you want to explain to the police why you're purchasing stolen property from a known embezzler." The broker didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his briefcase and bolted past me, nearly knocking over my security guard in his haste to disappear. Mark scrambled to gather the jewelry, his hands shaking so violently that the emerald brooch clattered to the floor. "It's mine. It's my family name. I'm just taking what's owed to me for 5 years of being your assistant." "You weren't an assistant, Mark. You were a parasite," I said, stepping closer. "And as for the Vance name, I bought that too. I've officially filed for a trademark injunction. You can't even use your own last name for business purposes anymore. You're a ghost." "I destroyed your house," he screamed, a manic, desperate grin breaking across his face. "I took the one thing you loved, those sketches, your mother. They're gone, Claire. You can have the money, but I took your heart." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold clarity of a finished project. "You didn't take my heart, Mark. You just cleared the site," I said. "I've already hired the best restoration team in the country. They're using the high-resolution digital scans I took of my mother's work years ago for insurance purposes. Your bleach stunt, it just gave me an excuse to build a state-of-the-art archive. You didn't destroy my past, you just made it fireproof." The sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder with every second. Mark's face went from manic to hollow. He looked at the window, then at the jewelry, then at me. "You're going to jail, Mark," I said. "For the embezzlement, for the vandalism, and for the theft of these heirlooms. And because I'm the primary witness and the owner of the firm you robbed, I'm going to make sure you get the maximum sentence. No plea deals, no early parole." The police swarmed the room a moment later. I stood back, watching as they forced Mark to the ground. The sight of him face down on a dirty motel carpet, being handcuffed while screaming my name, was the grand finale I had been waiting for. As they let him out, I picked up my father's Cartier watch from the bed. I wiped it clean and strapped it onto my own wrist. It was heavy. It was real. A week later, I stood in front of my house. The empty graffiti was gone. The black paint had been sanded away, and the walls were being rebuilt with reinforced steel and glass. It was no longer a Vance property. A new sign stood at the edge of the lawn, the archive. I had transformed my grief into a foundation. I had turned my silence into a roar. Mark was in a holding cell awaiting trial. Martha was living in a studio apartment funded by a state pension, her gentleman's agreement, nothing but a scrap of worthless paper. Marcus and Sarah were facing federal charges that would keep them tied up in court for a decade. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A new merger, a new opportunity, a new life. I didn't answer it immediately. Instead, I looked up at the sun hitting the glass of my new home. For the first time in years, the house wasn't just quiet. It was peaceful. I had won, and I didn't have to say a word.